At Sunday dinner, my daughter called me a gross old man right in front of my 4 young grandchildren. Kids, get away from that gross old man. He smells bad and he's disgusting. As everyone laughed and the grandkids stared at me with contempt, I pulled out my phone and made a call, putting it on speaker. Hello, Mr. Johnson? Yes, it's me. I want to update my will, right now. Take my daughter's name off the $2.5 million immediately. She choked on her food, her face turning purple, while her husband dropped his fork onto his plate with a clatter. When I hung up the phone, the worst part happened. The silence in the room got thick, as if someone had slammed the windows shut and killed the AC. The kids, who seconds before were looking at me with disgusted faces, were now frozen, not fully understanding the weight of my words. My daughter, Sarah, swallowed hard, pounding her chest as her husband, Mark, offered her a glass of water with a trembling hand. I didn't take my eyes off her. 63 years of watching that woman grow up, taking care of her through sicknesses, falls, and the men who had hurt her. And now she was calling me a gross old man, like I was some burden, an embarrassment, just a piece of human trash sitting at her table. I remember the smell of the pot roast still hanging in the dining room. The good white tablecloth, the one that had been her mother's, was covered in crumbs and grease. The wine, opened less than an hour ago, now had the metallic taste of betrayal. Dad, Sarah finally managed to say between coughs, her face red, her eyes shining with both rage and fear. Don't be ridiculous. I wasn't serious. Oh, I interrupted, with a calmness I didn't recognize in myself. Of course you were serious. Your words always are. No one else dared to speak. My other son, David, just watched the scene with his mouth half open, as if he suddenly realized this dinner wouldn't be a pleasant memory for his kids, but a crack that could never be fixed. I stayed silent for a few seconds, savoring the tension, because there was something in that moment that, while painful, gave me a strange sense of justice. For years I'd swallowed the humiliations, the poisonous comments disguised as jokes, the looks of pity when I complained about my arthritis or my sleepless nights. But that word, gross, thrown in front of my grandkids, had lit a fire in me that I couldn't put out anymore. The kids didn't move from their chairs. The oldest, Jacob, just 9 years old, stared at me with a frown, as if my very presence made him uncomfortable. Little Lucy hid her face in her mother's shoulder like I was a monster. That image stabbed me in the chest like a knife. I poured myself another glass of wine. I raised it with an almost theatrical slowness and looked at it against the light, as if making a toast to the ghosts that always keep me company. I thought of her mother, of how she'd be watching all this from wherever she was, and I couldn't help but smile bitterly. Ridiculous? I repeated, as if tasting the word. Then I took a sip and added, what's ridiculous is this whole fake love performance you've all been putting on for years. Mark, my son-in-law, tried to pull himself together and let out a nervous laugh, trying to dilute the poison of my words. Come on, Frank, it's not that big a deal. Sarah was just kidding. You know how she is. I turned my gaze on him slowly, like someone aiming a gun. Don't take me for an idiot, Mark. A joke is when everyone laughs, not when one person is left shattered. He looked down, like a scolded child. It was then I understood I had hit a nerve I didn't expect, the discomfort of a man who never had the courage to contradict his wife, and who lived off my silence and my generosity. The food was getting cold on the plates, but no one was hungry. The murmur of the TV in the living room, with some football game on in the background, seemed like a mockery from another world, a reminder that outside, life went on, while in here, in my dining room, something was dying. The phone still rested on the tablecloth, its screen dark like a watchful eye. I knew Mr. Johnson would pick up eventually, and that my words weren't just an outburst, they were a decree. For weeks I had been thinking about it, about how to distribute what I had left of this life, and now I had decided with a clarity that chilled me to the bone. My daughter shot up from her chair, pushing it back. The screech of the wood on the floor sounded like a scream. You can't do this to me, she yelled, with tears that looked more like fury than pain. I'm your daughter, your only daughter. I stood up too, with the slowness of my worn-out knees, but with the firmness of a man unwilling to back down. That's exactly why, Sarah, I said. Because you are my daughter. Because you were everything to me. Because I carried you in my arms when your mother no longer could. Because I stayed up with your fevers and sold my time to pay for your college. That's exactly why this hurts more than any insult." She looked at me with glassy eyes, trembling. Mark put a hand on her shoulder, but she shoved it away violently. In that moment, something unexpected happened. It wasn't a shout or a slap or someone fainting. It was a silence, but a silence that hit like thunder, because the kids, who had been in the background until then, broke the calm with a phrase that tore me apart more than all their mother's words. "Mom's right," said Jacob, looking at me with the coldness of a miniature adult. "You smell bad," Lucy laughed, imitating her brother. The other two, infected by it, let out stifled giggles. And Sarah, as if she had received divine forgiveness, hugged them, beaming with pride. I felt the world collapse beneath my feet. It wasn't just my daughter who despised me. It was my grandkids, my supposed legacy, my hope for the future. The bloodline I thought would one day remember me with love was now mocking me like I was a clown. I brought the wine glass to my lips and finished it in one gulp. I set the glass down on the table with a hard thud, and as the bitterness burned my throat, I knew it wouldn't end with this pathetic Sunday scene. Something bigger was coming, something that would shake the foundations of my entire family. Because the worst part was still yet to come. That night, after dinner, I locked myself in my room and turned off the lights. The silence was so thick I could hear my own bones creak as I sat on the bed. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't rest. Instead of sleep, memories came, as if someone had unleashed them from a dusty drawer I never wanted to open again. I saw Sarah, my daughter, at just 6 years old, running through the backyard in a yellow sundress her mother had sewn with her own hands. Her knees were scraped, her hair was full of dirt, and she had a laugh so contagious that even the birds seemed to stop and listen. I'd be chasing her with a bucket of water, and she'd scream with laughter, "Daddy, Daddy, you can't catch me!" And even though I could, I always let her win. I'd fall to the grass, faking exhaustion. She'd throw herself at my neck, and I'd hug her tight. That little girl existed. She wasn't an invention of my memory. She was real, and I held her in my arms. Then another image came, a more bitter one. Sarah as a teenager, her eyes burning with rebellion. I was working 12 hours a day at the woodshop, breaking my back so my kids wouldn't want for anything. I'd come home covered in sawdust, my hands cracked, and I'd be met with her hard stare, her impatient tone. Helen, her mother, was the one who softened the blows. I was the ogre who set rules, the one who didn't allow late nights or bad company. And yet, there was a day Sarah came home crying because some boy had dumped her. I didn't know what to say. I just bought her ice cream and sat with her in the park. She rested her head on my shoulder and mumbled, "Thanks, Dad. You're the only one who's always here." That sentence sustained me for years, like a lighthouse reminding me my sacrifice meant something. But everything changed when Helen got sick. Sarah was a woman of 20 by then. We spent months in hospitals, dealing with medicines and bills I couldn't pay. I was running myself ragged trying to get the money, and still, I felt like it was never enough. Helen was fading, and I was fading with her. I remember watching Sarah brush her hair at night, singing softly to help her sleep. I thought then, what a good woman life is forging in my daughter. But when her mother died, something inside her broke. The tenderness turned to rage, and that rage turned on me. She blamed me for not doing more, for not having money for some other treatment, for just being an ordinary man. I kept quiet, because I understood that behind those words was pain. But over the years I discovered that pain had turned into contempt. Then came Mark. I never trusted him. I met him with that smile that was too wide, the kind men use when they're hiding more than they show. Sarah loved him, and I didn't dare stand in the way. Let her be happy even if she's making a mistake, I thought. They got married, and at the wedding I cried like a baby. Not because I was losing her, but because I knew she didn't need me anymore. Mark seemed decent at first, but I soon saw who he really was. A social climber, someone who measured people by what they had, not who they were. And Sarah started going down that same path, as if his hunger for status was contagious. They moved into a big house surrounded by luxuries, and little by little, I was relegated to an uncomfortable corner of her life. One afternoon, when I was going to join them for a party, Sarah looked me up and down and said, "Dad, you can't go in that old jacket. People will talk." That sentence cut me like a spear. It wasn't just a comment, it was a judgment. To her, I had become someone to be ashamed of. The only thing that saved me for a while was my grandkids. When Jacob was born, they let me babysit him some afternoons. I'd push him in the stroller, proudly showing everyone he was my grandson. Then came Matthew, Lucy, and Claire, and each one of them brought back my will to live. I'd tell them made-up stories, take them to the park, teach them to tell the difference between the smells of wood. This is cedar, this is pine, this is oak. I'd repeat it, hoping to leave them a memory that one day, when I was gone, they'd associate those scents with me. For a while it worked. They'd hug me, look for me, call me Grandpa with real affection. But Sarah was always there, planting her poison. Don't get dirty with that old man. Don't smell like him. Don't listen to his old-fashioned stories. And so, little by little, the kids started to imitate her words. What was once affection turned into rejection until what happened on Sunday. And the worst part was hearing Jacob repeat the insult with the same coldness as his mother. That night I looked in the mirror. The light was dim and my face looked like a stranger's. Wrinkles lined my forehead, my dark circles were deep, and my gray hair barely covered my head. I leaned in and sniffed. I smelled like cheap soap, like wood, like old, maybe. I wondered if I really was disgusting, if my grandkids were right to look at me with repulsion. I wondered if I'd become a burden. I thought of Helen. She always used to tell me, "Frank, don't let Sarah confuse love with convenience. Protect her, even from herself." And I understood that maybe that was my mistake. I hadn't protected her from her own pride. I gave her everything I had, even what I couldn't spare, but I never taught her to value what really mattered. I lay down in bed with the phone in my hand, the lawyer's number still on the screen, and I understood that my decision to cut her out of the will wasn't an outburst. It was the consequence of a lifetime. Sarah would have to look in the mirror one day and recognize what she had become. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. And with that thought, I fell asleep, knowing that the worst was still to come. The scene from Sunday replayed in my head over and over, like a broken record I couldn't stop. There was something in those laughs, in my grandkids' eyes sparkling with mockery, that left me breathless. But what weighed on me most wasn't the insult itself, but the certainty that it hadn't been an accident or a spur-of-the-moment reaction. There was poison at that table, and it had been distilling in silence for years. When I looked back at Sarah that day, her face distorted and her breathing ragged, I saw more than my daughter. I saw a woman dominated by resentment, as if she'd been bottling up a hatred for too long that just needed to burst out. And I also saw Mark, his hand still trembling, trying to pull himself together. The fallen fork on his plate was the perfect metaphor. A man who didn't know how to hold on to what was in front of him. No one dared to speak. David, my younger son, was barely breathing. His eyes darted from his sister to me, as if looking for a life raft that didn't exist. His two kids, my other two grandkids, stared intently at their plates, too young to understand the scale of what was happening, but old enough to feel that something irreparable had broken. I broke the silence with a tiny gesture. I poured myself another glass of wine. The liquid hit the glass with a sharp sound, amplified by the total silence. I took a sip and tasted the bitterness. It wasn't just the wine. It was the bitterness of knowing I was surrounded by betrayals disguised as family. "Your words don't get erased, Sarah," I said, my voice low but firm. "Don't try to backpedal now." She jumped to her feet, tears streaking her makeup, and screamed, "It's because you don't understand anything. You were always hard on me, always judging me. You never let me be who I wanted to be. You're a selfish old man." Mark tried to grab her arm, but she shoved him away as if his touch burned her. She looked at me with such pure hatred that for a second I believed she hated me more than she had ever loved me. I watched her in silence, and then, like a revelation, I understood that what had come out of her mouth wasn't improvised. It wasn't the fury of a moment. It was something that had been fermenting for years, maybe since her mother died, maybe even before. The dinner had just been the perfect excuse to let it all out. Mark, nervously, tried to smooth things over. Frank, let's not be like this. Family is family. You know we all love you. I turned to him calmly. Don't use the word love so lightly, Mark. You've never loved me. You've only tolerated me because I represent something you covet. He swallowed hard, looking down like a kid caught in a lie. And right there, I saw it clearly. The son-in-law who had settled into my shadow, waiting for the day that shadow disappeared so he could take what I had built with my hands. In that moment, Sarah let out a dry, harsh laugh, as if trying to rip away what little dignity I had left. You really think I care about your money? She spat, her eyes blazing. The only thing that matters is that you're a nobody now. You're an old man who smells bad, who's useless. Do you know what my kids think of you? That you're a burden. The words pierced my chest like knives, not because they were new, but because they were coming from the mouth of the same girl who once told me I was the only one who was always there. I looked at Jacob, the oldest, and saw him nod silently, repeating his mother's words in his head. The table, which should have been a place of unity, had become an invisible battlefield. The white tablecloth, stained with wine and grease, now looked like a burial shroud covering the remains of a family that had died in that very instant. I stood up slowly, leaning my hands on the back of my chair to support myself. My knees felt weak, but my voice came out strong, stronger than I expected. If you consider me a burden, I said, looking at every one of them, one by one, then I'll leave. But remember one thing. A burden is something you set aside. A father, on the other hand, leaves footprints, and you'll carry those footprints on you even if you try to erase them. The silence was absolute. Sarah stared at me, her face deformed by rage. Mark avoided my gaze. The kids whispered among themselves. And David looked like he was about to break. I picked up my phone, left my half-finished glass of wine, and walked to the door. Before leaving, I turned my head. You think the worst has already happened. You have no idea. And I closed the door behind me, taking with me not just my wounded dignity, but also a decision that could no longer be contained. Because what happened at that table wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The worst, as always, was still yet to come. I couldn't sleep that night. The clock hit 2, then 3, then 4, and I was still tossing and turning in bed like a caged animal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same scene. Sarah's face twisted with hatred, my grandkids' laughter echoing the insult, Mark's cowardly silence, and David's broken stare. The darkness of the room wasn't enough to hide the clarity of that memory. I asked myself over and over where I had failed. Was I too strict when she was a girl? Too poor to give her the life she deserved? Too clumsy to fill the void Helen left? The word disgusting echoed in my mind like a war drum. It was more than an insult. It was a verdict from someone who had decided I wasn't worth anything anymore. I got up, went to the bathroom, and turned on the light. The mirror showed me the image of a man I no longer recognized. Deep wrinkles, tired skin, my eyes dull like cooling embers. I brought my face to the glass, inhaled deeply, and tried to smell myself. Did I really smell bad? I smelled cheap soap, a trace of wine, maybe the sweat from the afternoon, but nothing unbearable. However, what matters isn't the real smell, but what they decide to see in me. And if they see me as a repulsive old man, then that's the truth that's etched in their minds. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, the towel over my legs, and remembered times when Sarah had let slip little doses of contempt. Once, at Christmas 3 years ago, I gave her a hand-knitted wool coat. She opened it in front of everyone, looked at it coldly, and said, "Thanks, Dad, but nobody wears these knits anymore." Everyone laughed, and I swallowed, saying nothing. Another time, when I wanted to take the kids to the wood shop to teach them how to sand wood, she cut me off. "No, Dad, I don't want them smelling like sawdust or getting dirty with that old junk." I nodded, as if she were right, but it hurt like a punch to the gut. These scenes had piled up like layers of dust on my dignity, and I, instead of cleaning them off, had let them be, believing that in time she would come to her senses. I was wrong. The dust had become a crust, the crust a scar, and now, in front of my grandkids, the wound had been torn open. It wasn't just my daughter's betrayal, it was the silent complicity of everyone else. David, My younger son, who was always quiet and conciliatory, just froze, unable to defend me. Mark, with that subservient smile, preferred to hide his head. And my grandkids, they laughed. That was the final blow. I remembered the nights I stayed awake to pay for Sarah's college, the furniture I built with my own hands and sold for half its price, the vacations I never took because I saved everything for them. I wondered, what was it all for? What did they have left of me? Just the idea that I'm a burden, an unpleasant smell, a nuisance. I lay down again, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then Helen's voice appeared in my mind, as clear as if she were next to me. "Frank," she always said, "take care of Sarah even if she doesn't understand. Don't let her get lost." And for the first time, I felt I had failed. Not because Sarah insulted me, but because I hadn't known how to stop her from becoming the woman she was now. Cold, arrogant, unable to recognize where she came from. Tears surprised me. I hadn't cried in years. I cried like a child in silence so as not to wake anyone, biting the sheet to muffle the sobs. I wasn't just crying over the insult, but over the certainty that I had lost my daughter long before that dinner. Sunday was just the confirmation. But in between the tears, I felt something different. It wasn't just pain. It was rage. A rage forming in the deepest part of my chest, like an ember refusing to die. And that rage gave me strength. I got out of bed and found my phone. The lawyer's number was still saved on the screen. I looked at it for a long time, my fingers trembling over the keypad. The decision was made. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was justice. A justice that had been delayed for far too long. When I got back in bed, dawn was breaking through the window. The sky was painted a heavy gray, as if the city itself shared my grief. I settled into the sheets, damp from my tears, and swore to myself that I would never again allow such a humiliation. What Sarah didn't know was that with her insult, she had awakened something in me that even I didn't know existed. The determination not to leave my life in the hands of those who despise me. And as the sun began to light up the room, I understood that the true weight of the betrayal wasn't what Sarah had said to me. It was what I was about to do with that pain. The week after the dinner was a silent procession of poisoned memories and thoughts. The air seemed heavier, and every corner of my house was filled with echoes of Helen, of Sarah as a child, of the days when everything was different. It was hard to accept that what happened on Sunday wasn't an accident, but the result of something that had been brewing for a long time. Sarah hadn't improvised that contempt. She had cultivated it like a dark seed that finally bloomed in front of my grandkids. One afternoon, while I was looking over some papers in the workshop, I found a folder I hadn't opened in years. It was a file with invoices, receipts, letters. Among them were notes from Sarah when she was a teenager, requests for money, excuses for not being home on time, little deceptions that I had overlooked at the time. But rereading them with old eyes, I realized they weren't innocent. Sarah had learned very early on how to manipulate me, to get what she wanted with tears or with silence, and I, believing I was being a good father, had always given in. I remembered one time she disappeared from home for 2 days, when she was 17. She came back saying she had stayed at a friend's house. I didn't question her. I just asked her not to do it again. Months later, I found out by chance that she had been with an older man, a married guy. When I confronted her, she screamed that I had no right to meddle in her life, that she wasn't a child anymore. That day, instead of imposing my authority, I backed down and convinced myself it was just part of her being young. I was wrong. It was part of her character, of the poison she carried inside. And Mark was no stranger to this equation. I knew from the beginning that he saw me more as an ATM than a father-in-law. He always asked about my savings, about the value of the land where my workshop is, about the house I still live in. At first, he disguised it as family concern, but over the years, he didn't even bother to hide it. One day, I overheard him talking on the phone, thinking I wasn't around. He was telling someone, "When the old man finally kicks the bucket, Sarah and I will be set." His words drilled into my head. I didn't confront him then, but I never forgot that sentence. My daughter's mask fell off that Sunday, but Mark's had been cracking for a long time. Sarah, with her insult, only confirmed what I already knew, that in her house I was an uncomfortable guest, a nuisance they tolerated just to keep the hope of an inheritance alive. What hurt me most wasn't the greed, but that Sarah went along with it. Because while Mark was an opportunist, she was my daughter, the girl who once told me I was the only one who was always there. And yet, she had decided to turn that closeness into a weapon, to use my love as a weakness. The insult wasn't just a humiliation. It was a calculated blow, an open declaration that she no longer needed me, and that all she wanted from me was my silence and my inheritance. That same evening, I got a call from David. His voice was low, as if he were hiding. "Dad," he said, "don't take what happened on Sunday so seriously. Sarah was on edge. She just went too far." I was speechless for a few seconds. Then I replied, "On edge? Your sister called me a gross old man in front of my grandkids. That's not a mistake, David. That's what she thinks of me." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, my son whispered, I also think Sarah has changed. Mark has poisoned her, Dad. She's not the same." "No, David," I told him. "She's always been the same. I just didn't want to see it." I hung up, my heart heavy. It was the first time David had acknowledged anything close to what I felt, but it was too late. The masks had fallen, and what was behind them was a face I could no longer love without reservation. I sat in the armchair in the dining room, in the dark, surrounded by shadows. I remembered Helen's words. Protect her, even from herself. And I understood that protecting doesn't always mean giving. Sometimes it means taking away what hurts most, what binds most, what feeds the poison. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt at the thought of punishing my daughter. It wasn't the outburst of a wounded father. It was the clarity of a man who had seen too much and could no longer stay blind. The insult, the laughter, the silence from everyone. None of it was improvised. It was the culmination of years of contempt, and I knew, with the certainty of the decided, that it was time to settle the score. Monday morning, I called Mr. Johnson's office again. This time, I didn't do it in an outburst in front of the whole family, but in the solitude of my workshop, with the smell of wood in the air and the calm of knowing exactly what I was doing. The phone rang twice before his secretary answered, with that robotic voice I always find uncomfortable. "Mr. Frank? The attorney was expecting your call," she said, as if she knew sooner or later I would call. When I heard the lawyer's deep voice, I felt a strange weight in my chest, a mix of relief and betrayal, because what I was about to do wasn't a whim or even momentary revenge. It was something I had been preparing for months, long before that dinner. The truth is, I had already drafted a new will some time ago. What happened on Sunday was just the spark that lit the fuse. Mr. Johnson knew my doubts, my fears, my complaints. More than once, I had confessed to him how much it hurt to see Sarah transformed into someone I barely recognized. He would listen to me in silence, taking notes in his cramped handwriting as if he knew every word of mine would be key to what would eventually happen. And that day, with a firm voice, I told him, "It's time. I want it in writing. My daughter Sarah is out of the will." On the other end of the line, a brief silence, as if for confirmation. "I understand, Frank. And the rest? Does it stay as we discussed?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yes. Everything just as we discussed." I hung up and stood still, phone in hand, feeling like I had just ripped out a part of my heart. Because Sarah, as treacherous and ungrateful as she was still my daughter, and excluding her from what I built my whole life wasn't easy, even if it was fair. But at the same time, the decision gave me a strange peace, like someone finally setting down an unbearable weight. I poured myself a coffee and sat by the workbench. The lumber was piled in a corner, waiting to be sanded, turned into furniture, into memories. I thought about how I had always lived surrounded by things that transform. A log could become a table, a chair, a casket. And now it was my turn to transform myself, from a doting father to an implacable man. What Sarah and Mark didn't know was that I had already anticipated their greed. I wasn't naive, no matter how much they believed it. Every fake smile, every calculated gesture of affection had shown me what they really wanted from me. That's why, long before that meal, I had decided my inheritance would not be for them. The money they were waiting for like vultures was destined for someone else, someone who had shown loyalty without asking for anything in return. As I drank my coffee, I remembered Sarah's face when she heard my call at the table. That purplish color in her face, that mix of rage and fear. It was the confirmation that everything I had suspected for years was true. My daughter wasn't crying for love, she was crying for money. She wasn't screaming because she was hurt, but because of greed. That certainty hurt, but it also gave me strength. In the afternoon, I went to the lawyer's office in person. I walked slowly, leaning on my cane, and when I entered, the smell of paper and ink hit me like a reminder of finality. Mr. Johnson greeted me with a handshake and led me to his office. There, on the table, was the document, already prepared. I read every word carefully. Each clause was a hammer blow on the image I still held of Sarah as that little girl in the yellow dress running through the yard. I signed with a firm hand, even though my soul was trembling inside. When I finished, the lawyer looked at me with respect and said, "Not everyone has the courage to do what you just did." I just nodded. Courage wasn't the word. It was more like desperation, or maybe justice. As I left the office, the cold afternoon air hit my face. I took a deep breath. The weight on my shoulders seemed to have lightened. I walked a few blocks with the feeling that something had changed forever. There was no going back. As I headed home, a disturbing thought crept in. Sarah wouldn't just sit back and take this. I knew her too well. Her pride, her arrogance, and her ambition wouldn't let her calmly accept what I had decided. The dinner had just been a spark. What came next would be a fire. That night, as I got into bed, I felt the house was emptier than ever. Helen was gone, my grandkids had rejected me, and Sarah no longer existed for me. But at the same time, something new had been born. A plan. And the worst part, the part everyone feared but didn't know yet, was just beginning. The hardest part wasn't confronting Sarah or signing that will that left her with nothing. The hardest part was facing the look in my grandkids' eyes, that contempt in their little eyes, which cut me deeper than any adult insult. Because I could stand my daughter hating me. I could stand Mark's greed, even David's cowardly silence. But what I couldn't accept was the children's laughter, with my name turned into a joke. Days passed and I didn't see them again. Not a visit, not a call, nothing. The silence was the cruelest answer, because it confirmed that in those kids' minds, I was already the grandpa who smells bad, the gross old man they had to stay away from. I wondered what they would remember of me when they grew up. The walks to the park, the stories I made up, the smell of wood on my hands, or just that one scene, frozen in their memories, of their mother pointing at me like I was a leper. I remember clearly the first time I held Jacob, the oldest. He was a fragile newborn, with a little blue hat covering his head. I was trembling more than he was, afraid of hurting him. Helen was still alive then, and watched me, smiling, saying, "It's okay, Frank. You're his grandpa. He knows." That feeling of tenderness was etched in my chest like a tattoo. And to think that same boy, 9 years later, would tell me in a cold voice, "Mom's right, you smell bad," just broke me to pieces every time I remembered it. It was the same with the other 3. I taught Lucy how to ride her bike. I ran behind her until I was out of breath, picking her up every time she fell. "You can do it, sweetie. You can do it," I'd repeat. The day she finally managed to ride without falling, she hugged me, yelling, "Grandpa, I did it." That same girl now hid her face in her mother's shoulder, as if I were a monster. Matthew and Claire were younger, but they had laughed with me too. They had played building little houses with scraps from my workshop. They'd ask me to teach them how to hammer nails, and I'd pretend I needed their help so they felt important. Now they also looked at me with the same look of rejection learned from their mother. The pain from grandkids is a slow poison. It doesn't kill right away, but it rots you from the inside, leaving an impossible void. I found myself talking to the walls, imagining they were there, asking them to forgive me for being the grandpa who didn't know how to protect them from their mother's cruelty. I'd dream about them, about their voices calling me, and I'd wake up to an empty bed and a dry throat from crying in silence. There was one afternoon when I thought about going to find them. about showing up at Sarah's house and demanding to see them. But I stopped. What right did I have to burst into their lives when they had already condemned me? What would I gain? Another humiliation? Another insult repeated by innocent lips? No. I decided to stay in my house, holding on to memories as if they were sacred relics. I'd sit in the workshop and pull out the drawings they had made for me from a drawer, sloppy drawings of houses, trees, of figures with mustaches that I kept like treasures. On one, Jacob had written, "For my grandpa, the strongest in the world." I'd read those words over and over, like someone tracing a scar, and I'd wonder at what point he stopped seeing me like that and started seeing me as a burden. The pain made me clearer. I understood that Sarah hadn't just taken her love away from me. She had contaminated my grandkids' love. It was as if she had ripped up my roots and rotted them with poison. And I couldn't let that be the only legacy I left. One night, trying to sleep, I felt Helen's voice again, as if she were whispering to me from beyond. "Don't give up, Frank. They're still children. One day they'll see the truth." But I wasn't so sure. A mother's poison is powerful, and sometimes it lasts a lifetime. However, in that same whisper, I found a new determination. If Sarah had turned my grandkids into my judges, I would do whatever it took so that one day they would face the truth of who their grandfather really was. The idea of revenge, which until then was just a murmur, began to take shape. It wasn't about money or inheritance anymore. It was about memory. I was not going to let my story be reduced to an insult repeated at a Sunday dinner table. No. My name had to have weight. It had to echo. It had to leave a mark. And even if it cost me my life, I would make those kids remember who I really was. What they didn't know was that I had already started pulling the strings. And soon, very soon, the masks would fall, not just on my daughter, but on everyone. That night I turned on the bedroom lamp and took a handkerchief from my nightstand drawer, one that still held Helen's perfume. It had been more than 20 years since she died, but every time I brought the fabric to my face, the faint scent of lavender brought me back to our shared bed. To the early mornings when she would stroke my hair as I came home, exhausted from the woodshop. I closed my eyes, and as I had so many times before, I began to talk to her. Not out loud, but with the voice one keeps in the soul, the one that doesn't need sound to be heard. "Helen," I murmured, "I know you can hear me. I know somehow you're here, watching what's happening. What did I do wrong? Where did I mess up with Sarah? You always said I was too hard, too strict, that I needed to learn to let go a little. Could it be that I lost her because I never learned how?" The silence of the room filled with her imagined presence. I saw her sitting in the chair across from me, in her blue dress with that serene look that always calmed my storms. "Don't beat yourself up, Frank," she seemed to say. "You did what you could with the tools you had. Not all children know how to receive the love they're given." I broke down then, because her voice, even invented in my tired mind, gave me something I couldn't find in anyone else: understanding. I told her everything, as if she hadn't seen it from wherever she was. I told her about Sarah's insult, the grandkids' laughter, the call to the lawyer, the final signature that erased our daughter from the inheritance. Saying it out loud made it hurt even more. "Do you really think I did the right thing?" I asked her, as if Helen could absolve me. In my memory, she stroked my hand. "What you did was necessary. Sarah chose a path that isn't ours. You can't force her to love what she despises, but you still have something to do." That last sentence echoed in my mind like a command. You still have something to do. I didn't know what it was exactly, but I felt I couldn't just sit back and wait for my life to be consumed by the silence of my workshop and my loneliness. There was one more step, one that involved confronting not only Sarah and Mark, but also my grandkids, and the memory they were building of me. I looked at Helen's photo on the dresser. Her smile was the same as always, but in my eyes, it was mixed with reproach. "You left too soon," I told her, "and you left me with this burden alone. You knew how to get through to Sarah, how to calm her, how to show her what mattered. I didn't know how. Maybe if you had been here, everything would be different." The silence became unbearable. I stood up, went to the workshop, and turned on the light. Among the tools, I found a wooden box I had made years ago to keep letters. In it were several notes Helen had left me when she was sick, brief messages full of love. "Thank you for not leaving me alone. You are my strength. Don't forget the children need you." Reading them, an idea began to grow in me. What if these words, these letters, one day ended up in my grandkids' hands? What if they discovered for themselves the truth of who I was, of who we were, Helen and I? I understood then. The revenge couldn't just be a financial punishment for Sarah. It had to be an act of memory. She could poison my grandkids today, but she couldn't control what they discovered tomorrow. And I would make sure that when they grew up, they would know who their grandfather really was. I stayed in the workshop until dawn, talking to Helen as if she were sitting right next to me. I promised her I wouldn't leave this world without leaving a clear, indelible trace of what I had done and who I had been. "They won't steal my history," I told her, clutching the box of letters to my chest. When the sun came through the window, I felt her smiling at me from somewhere, and although I was still broken inside, I had a new certainty. The worst was still to come, but this time, it wouldn't find me defenseless. The following days, I spent in silence, moving through my house like a ghost. But inside, I was no longer a defeated man, but someone putting a plan together. I realized I couldn't keep waiting for Sarah and Mark to continue corrupting the memory my grandkids had of me. It was time to act, not just with words, but with deeds that would leave a mark. I started by organizing the will papers. Mr. Johnson had given me several sealed envelopes with official copies, and one of them was meant to be opened only after my death. But I wasn't planning on waiting that long. I decided that part of my revenge would be seen while I was alive, with my own eyes. I didn't just want Sarah out of the will. I wanted her to know that everything she hoped to get from me was already crumbling. That morning, I went to the bank. With my calloused hands, I signed the papers to transfer a significant sum, not all of it, but enough, to a local foundation that helped low-income kids learn trade skills. I had always dreamed that one of my grandkids would learn woodworking, that they would carry the smell of wood and the dignity of labor on their hands. If Sarah had decided to rip that away from them, I would at least give it to other kids who did want to receive it. I felt Helen was with me as I signed, as if she approved every stroke of my pen. Afterward, I called David, my younger son, the only one who still had a shred of loyalty. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop, far from the ears of Sarah and Mark. When he arrived, I saw he looked older than I remembered, his hair sprinkled with gray and his eyes tired. He sat across from me without a word. "Dad," he started, "Sarah is furious. She says you're going to regret this." I took a deep breath before answering. "David, I don't care about her fury. What I care about is you knowing the truth. I'm not leaving a single dollar to your sister or to Mark. I'm not going to reward their contempt." He nodded slowly, looking down. "I don't want anything from you, Dad. I just don't want you to end up alone." Those words cut me more than any insult. I reached out and put my hand on his. "I'm not going to be alone, son. I have your mother, I have my memories, and now I have a plan." David looked at me with damp eyes, as if he wanted to ask what that plan was, but he didn't dare, and I didn't tell him. Not yet. When I got back to the workshop, I took out Helen's box of letters and started organizing them. I decided that each grandchild would receive one when they reached a certain age, along with photos, mementos, and my voice recorded on old cassette tapes I had saved in a drawer. I wanted them, when they grew up, to discover the truth about their grandfather for themselves. It didn't matter how much poison their mother fed them now. Sooner or later, those letters would be a mirror in which they would see themselves reflected, and perhaps be ashamed. But not everything would be so clean. I had also decided to expose Sarah and Mark. For years, I'd saved proof of their greed. Messages, recordings, documents. Mark had asked me for money for family investments that never existed. Sarah had lied to me about loans that were really just for luxuries. I, who had always been the naive father, had saved everything. Now, that file would be my weapon. As I sorted the evidence into folders, I felt my hands regain their old firmness. They were no longer the hands of a defeated old man, but of a man who knows exactly what he's building. Every page, every receipt, every printed message was like a nail in the structure of my plan. A silent but devastating revenge. I went to bed late that night, exhausted but with a new energy. I closed my eyes and saw Helen's face. This time, she wasn't looking at me with reproach or sadness, but with a faint pride. "That's it, Frank," she seemed to say. "Don't let them erase you." I smiled in the darkness. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I wasn't the one losing. They were. And I knew that what I was preparing wouldn't just take away the money they coveted, but it would strip their lies bare in front of everyone. Sarah thought she could laugh at me at the Sunday dinner table. She would soon discover that the gross old man still had a sharp edge to his soul. The worst, I thought before falling asleep, hasn't happened yet. But this time, when it comes, I'll be the one causing it. The afternoon, everything exploded. The sky was gray, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. I did what I had to do. I contacted a reporter who had been showing interest in my story for weeks. It wasn't for fame or public revenge. It was because the truth needed witnesses. I gave her the folders with the invoices, the messages, and the proof of the loans Mark never paid back. She took the evidence with a calmness that impressed me and promised to publish it. The next day, before dawn, the reporter called me. "It's running today," she said. I felt a deep sense of vertigo. When the article appeared online, the news spread like wildfire. They didn't mention everything at once, but it was enough. Suspicious transfers, unexplained expenses, forged contracts. People started talking in low voices. I walked down the sidewalk and heard my name being whispered in a coffee shop. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, others with judgment. The local radio station called me. I went into the booth and told my truth, unvarnished. I talked about the insult at the table, the years of indifference, the proof in those folders. I wasn't trying to spread rage. My voice just carried the exhaustion of a man who refused to be invisible any longer. As I spoke, I felt something shatter, and at the same time, something was set free. The truth couldn't fit in the silence anymore. Around noon, I saw a moving truck pull up to my daughter's house. They were carrying out boxes and furniture I had once considered part of her inheritance. I saw Mark, his face pale, packing half-filled suitcases. People who used to applaud his success now looked away. Sarah was screaming. She was trying to rewrite the story, to explain the unexplainable with words that sounded hollow. But the evidence was clear, and the town, nosy and fast, was already spreading it. The kids found out sooner than I imagined. In the mid-afternoon, Jacob called me. His voice was trembling. He let it slip that kids were talking at school. "Grandpa, they're saying things at school," he murmured. I felt the ground open up beneath me. I tried to explain in simple terms that there were things Mom and Mark had hidden, that I never wanted them to find out this way. He asked me if I was a bad person. I didn't want him to believe that. I told him I loved him, that he was the only one who wasn't part of this adult business. He hung up, and my chest felt empty. The school was filled with whispering parents. Some defended Sarah and talked about a vengeful father. Others looked at Mark with suspicion. The truth, I thought, shows no mercy. When it runs, it leaves a mark on everyone. The next day, my phone rang. It was David. "Dad, you've made a mess for us," he said. He blamed me for exposing everything without considering the damage to the kids. I tried to explain that I did what I had to, that I couldn't uphold the lie any longer. He just repeated his fear that the family was broken. And I heard in his voice the confusion of someone seeing his family with new eyes for the first time. Then, something happened that none of us expected. Mark tried to flee. I wanted to believe it was just a stupid impulse, but the police were already on alert because of the complaints and the bank movements. They intercepted him at the airport with suitcases and rushed paperwork. There was a struggle. The live news feed showed his pale face, his wrinkled shirt, his trembling hands. The cameras don't forgive. They filmed him in handcuffs, humiliated. Sarah, distracted by the tragedy she herself had created, showed up at the police station, broken, begging for explanations, offering money for silence. I can't deny I felt an immediate relief. That man would never look at me with superiority again. But the joy was brief. My daughter's reaction was devastating in a different way. She went after the reporter, slinging accusations and offering bribes. She tried to regain control as if a reputation could be sewn back together with money. The reporter held firm. The story stood. Seeing Sarah beg for respect and seeing Mark in handcuffs tore me up inside, but it also gave me the certainty that the truth, however cruel, had worked. At the same time, the press began to question my methods. Some columnists painted me as the guilty one for exposing the children, for not protecting family bonds. There were plenty of voices saying I had gone too far. It hurt because I had acted from a place of pain and the need not to be forgotten, but I had to admit my actions weren't harmless. They had pulled up roots, and the fall had hit branches I never meant to touch. That night, in the dim light of the workshop, my phone rang again. It was Sarah. She spoke as if the words were knives being ripped from her throat. "Dad, we've lost everything," she said. She broke into sobs. The kids were demanding explanations. Her job was slipping away. The shame was following her. "What did you want?" she asked me. I confessed the truth with the coldness of the inevitable. "I wanted you to know, for you to know, and for you to make it right." We found no comfort. We hung up like two strangers. The following week brought more consequences. Neighbors left supportive letters at my door, while other people wrote accusations on social media. Sarah's reputation was damaged. Mark's was, for the time being, irreparable. My grandkids were confused. David grew distant. And yet, in a corner of my workshop, an anonymous note appeared among the slats of wood, a photo of Helen when she was young and a short sentence. "Your story gave us courage. We're with you." I never found out who left it, but those words gave me comfort. I had achieved what I wanted. The truth was out, but it came at the price of an emotional earthquake that had reached the ones I loved most. I asked myself, with the honesty only the night affords, if the truth had been worth so much pain. I didn't find an easy answer. I only knew that the worst had happened. My daughter's mask and her husband's had fallen. The town had seen it, and everyone's life had changed. And I moved on. After the scandal came the silence, a silence heavier than any scream, more unbearable than any insult. The calls and visits stopped. Not even David, who had always been the closest, dared to show up at the house. And my grandkids, they vanished from my life as if they had never existed. They weren't guilty, I knew that, but the absence of their voices was the cruelest punishment. I spent my mornings sitting in the workshop, staring at the planks of wood I no longer had the strength to turn into anything. Sawdust covered the floor like forgotten snow, and I'd poke it with my cane, listening to the crunch like someone stepping on dry leaves. In there, surrounded by the tools that had been my pride, I felt my real inheritance wasn't the money or the property, but this silence that now kept me company. I wondered if Sarah thought of me, if ever, amid the chaos of lawyers, reporters, and gossiping neighbors, she remembered that I had been her father. I like to imagine that in some corner of her memory, the echo of the little girl in the yellow dress still remained, laughing as I chased her. But I'd immediately correct myself. The Sarah of today wasn't that girl. That girl had died with her mother, and in her place was someone I no longer recognized. At night, I'd talk to Helen, not out loud. I was afraid the neighbors would think I was losing my mind, but inside. I'd tell her the house was too empty, that the dining room table had lost its meaning, that the coffee tasted like ash. I'd tell her the distance from the grandkids hurt more than Sarah's betrayal, and she, in my imagination, would give me the same answer. Hold on, Frank. The truth is slow, but it arrives. One day I received a letter. It wasn't from Sarah or Mark. It was from a woman who had worked in my workshop years ago, helping with small jobs. She said she had read the story in the paper, that she knew what Sarah and her husband were really like, and that I shouldn't feel alone. The letter was short, but it brought me to tears, because sometimes comfort doesn't come from blood, but from where you least expect it. Mr. Johnson called me too. He wanted to make sure I was still firm in my decision. I told him yes. Sarah would not see a cent of what cost me so much sacrifice. That money would go to David and to the foundation I had chosen. And more importantly, the mementos, Helen's letters, and my recordings were all organized for my grandkids. Someday, when they were older, they would have the chance to see who I really was, far from their mother's words. The silence in the house pushed me to think too much. I discovered you can survive without company, but not without memory. The only thing keeping me on my feet was knowing my story wouldn't die with me, that Sarah's poison wouldn't be the last word. That was my true inheritance. Not the money, not the properties, but the truth, written on paper, in letters, in the recorded voice I had left for when I could no longer defend myself. And so, in the midst of that silence, I understood something. The revenge was complete, but it hadn't brought me back my daughter or my grandkids. It had left me alone, with my memories and my ghosts. It was a high price, maybe too high, but it was the only one I could pay. The last time I gathered the strength to set the table was a Sunday, just like that dinner that changed everything. I put out the white tablecloth with the flowers Helen had embroidered. I set out 6 glasses, even though I knew only I would be sitting down, and I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for years. I did it with the calm of someone performing a ritual, knowing it was the last time. I poured a glass slowly and raised it to the empty air. I toasted to Helen, to the days we laughed together without thinking about tomorrow. I toasted to David, who, though distant, still held on to some kindness. I toasted to my grandkids, even though they had looked at me with contempt, because one day, when they read my letters, they would know their grandfather wasn't the monster they were told he was. And I also toasted to Sarah, my daughter, not for who she was, but for who she once had been. For the little girl in the yellow dress running through the yard, for the teenager who told me I was the only one who was always there. That girl deserved a toast, even if the woman she became didn't. I set the glass on the table and picked up the envelope I had prepared. It was my last letter, written in my shaky handwriting, addressed to my whole family. In it, I explained what I had done, the will that excluded her, the inheritance destined for others, the truth I had left on tapes and in papers. I didn't write it with anger, but with the serenity of a man who knows he has nothing left to lose. I told them that one day, when the fury and shame faded, they would understand that I didn't want to destroy, but to make it clear who I was, that I would not allow my memory to be reduced to an insult at a Sunday dinner table. And I ended with a sentence I knew Sarah would never forget. Daughter, money can buy you silence, but it can't buy you a memory. And what you refuse to remember about me, others will remember for you. I folded the letter, put it next to the sealed envelope from the lawyer, and left them on the table. Then I poured another glass of wine and drank it slowly, as if I wanted to stop time. The clock struck 10 at night. Outside, the city was sleeping. Inside, my heart was also starting to get tired. That was my farewell. A toast in solitude, a will written not just on paper, but in actions. I don't know if Sarah will ever cry for me. I don't know if my grandkids will understand the magnitude of what happened. The only thing I know is that when I raise my last glass, my voice will remain in every letter, in every memory, in every truth I hid for them. And when that letter is read, when my words echo in their hands, the real revenge will be complete. Because then, they won't be able to laugh at me anymore. They will have to look in the mirror and recognize what they did. That will be my final toast. And I know that in silence Helen will be toasting with me.